So today we're going to focus on the first 50 years specifically and sort of our origin story if we were a superhero. Before we talk about Indianapolis as a city, first we need to talk about what was here beforehand, because I think that's important to understand. So picture Indianapolis 450 million years ago. At this time, we are a tropical seabed somewhere near the equator. And it's during this time that all of the state's limestone deposits are formed. Over millions of years, we move up to the northeast to our present position. The waters recede. And starting about 700,000 years ago, we have multiple periods of glaciation, which is the entrance of glaciers into the area from the north. 700,000 years ago that begins, it ends roughly 14,000 years ago with the final stage of glaciation, which is known as the Wisconsin stage. And on the screen, you can see the southern border of that Wisconsin stage glaciation. And if you know Indiana topography, you know that as soon as you get south of that line, the terrain changes. It starts to get much more hilly. And that's because we basically got squished by the glaciers, and they never did. These were glaciers hundreds of feet thick. It's impossible to even comprehend the weight of these. And so that's why northern and central Indiana are so flat. It's also the fact that when the glaciers receded, they deposited very rich soil as they left. And so that is what makes Indiana such a great farming area. So those glaciers were hugely important in shaping Indiana as it developed, and Indianapolis as well. So once those glaciers start to recede, we start to get the first peoples of Indiana. And this is in around 9500 BC. These first two groups, the Paleo-Indian and the Archaic period, these were primarily nomadic hunters and gatherers. When we get to the Woodland period, starting in 1000 BC, this is when we start to get settled agriculture, established trade networks, and complex burial rituals. If you are familiar with Mound State Park and the mound builders, they were from this period. And then the final period of prehistory is the Mississippian. And this is the last period before European contact. In this period, we have really intense agriculture, complex culture, settled town life, and in central Indiana, the Mississippian culture was called the Oliver phase. And this group had villages all up and down the White River. So very present here. There is no definite link between the cultures of the Mississippian period and the Native American tribes that we are familiar with in terms of things like, you know, the Shawnee and the Lenape and all those. It appears actually that after the Mississippian period, there is a gap of about 50 to 60 years where Indiana was essentially vacant. And then starting in about the 1660s, that's when we get the Native American tribes in the area that we're familiar with. The Miami came first, then the Potawatomi, then the Lenape and Delaware. All of these tribes were essentially refugees. They had been driven away from their original territory by European settlement. So they were coming west or coming south and settling here instead. Under first the French and then the English colonial powers, these groups were very active in the fur trade. And the French and then the English wanted them here because they were gathering a resource that was valuable to them. When the area came under US control, the emphasis wasn't so much on furs as it was on land, and the Americans wanted the land empty. So that's where you start to see the change happening here. So in 1783, the US took control of the area, and by 1809, controlled the southern third of the state, basically had in multiple different treaties, had acquired that land. And you can see on this map how the land was sort of going piecemeal in each treaty for that southern third of the state. In 1809, this this series of treaties came to an end and the negotiations stalled. And that's because the tribes started to see what was happening and basically banded together. They formed what was called the Grand Council of the Western Alliance, which consisted of more than 30 tribes. And they said, we are the official treaty negotiators for any land in this area. And that obviously didn't work. The US government just sort of sidestepped them and negotiated with more friendly organizations. And that's when we start to see some resistance led by Shawnee Chief Tecumseh, who you see here, and his brother, who was known as the Prophet. We know that unfortunately that resistance was fairly short-lived. And in 1818, the tribe signed what's called the Treaty of St. Mary's. And this is the treaty that cedes the area where Indianapolis now exists, that central third of the state, to the US government. So the treaty was signed in 1818, and the tribes agreed to vacate by 1821. And that year, 1821, is going to be really important to us because that is the founding of the year that Indianapolis was founded. While all this was going on, circa around 1800, we see our first, or one of the first, if not the first, white settlers in the area. Some of you may recognize William Connor, whose trading post and farm are now, of course, Connor Prairie up in Fishers. He had been raised by, his parents were missionaries, Moravian missionaries, who had raised him among the Lenape or Delaware. And so he spoke numerous tribal languages, was very familiar with tribal customs. And so he sort of became the intermediary in central Indiana in terms of helping to negotiate various treaties and things like that. So he built his trading post around the year 1800. And he actually married a woman, McKingus, who was the daughter of Chief Anderson. They had 6 children. But in 1821, when the other tribes left the area, McKingus's tribe did as well. So she left along with their 6 children, and William Connor stayed. We don't really know why he did that, why it worked out that way. But in this period of Indiana history, he is a hugely important figure in terms of getting, basically getting government established in the region. So just to review, first we have the colonial powers. Well, after obviously the prehistory, we have the colonial powers of France and England. Then in 1783, the area that will become Indianapolis becomes part of the United States, and at first part of Virginia, because they just decided that the states along the eastern seaboard would just extend their borders horizontally across the entire continent for some reason, until they worked out some other solution. So for a couple of years, we're part of Virginia. In 1787, we get the Northwest Ordinance that forms the Northwest Territory. In 1800, that Northwest Territory is divided into the Ohio and Indiana territories, which basically means that Ohio separated out. In 1805, Michigan breaks away. In 1809, Illinois and Wisconsin break away. So by 1809, we have what we essentially understand as the borders of Indiana today. It looks a little bit wonky here. Michigan looks especially wonky in this map because the Upper Peninsula is still part of Wisconsin at this time. But essentially now we have the borders as we understand them. In 1816, Indiana achieves a population of, the Indiana Territory, excuse me, achieves a population of 60,000 people. And that means that we are eligible for statehood. So in 1816, Indiana becomes a state. So that brings us to 1820. This is where we are in 1820. You will see that this sort of red bordered section in the middle, that is what's called the New Purchase. That is what the government acquired in the Treaty of St. Mary's in 1818. The blue up at the top is still controlled by various tribes. And you can see the southern third of the state by this time has been organized into counties. The majority of the population of Indiana at this time is living along the Ohio River because that's where the trade route is. That's where the goods are coming in and out. That's how settlers are getting into the area. So very strongly clustered along the Ohio River in the south. But in 1820, Indiana's governor, Jonathan Jennings, takes a look at this map, maybe not this specific map, but a map like this. And he foresees a time when the entire state will be populated by white settlers. So foresight on the part of the government, crazy, right? So he looks at this map and says, once this entire state is settled, it's not going to be fair that the capital is down on the southern border because it won't be accessible to everyone. It won't be equally accessible to everyone, especially when you consider the difficulties of travel at that time. For someone from the northern part of the state to have accessed state government resources would have been incredibly difficult. So he says what we need to do is put the capital in the middle of the state because that's fair. So there's nothing in the middle of the state. It's empty, essentially. In 1820 is when we get the first white settlers in this Indianapolis area. And in March of 1820 specifically, we have the McCormick family and the Pogue family. Now, the McCormicks and the Pogues have been arguing for 200 years about which of them got here first. Historians are divided on the issue, but they're here within a couple of weeks of each other, basically. Now, they shouldn't have been here because in 1820, the Native Americans still controlled this land. They still had a year to vacate. But I guess the McCormicks and the Pogues were just pretty eager. So they're here in the spring of 1820. By the summer of 1820, there are roughly 15 families living around in the general area that we think of as Indianapolis. But there was no town, there was no community of any kind. It was just farms, basically. So in May of 1820, some surveyors were sent by the General Assembly to try to select a site for the new capital somewhere in central Indiana. And as you can see, they had to camp along the river because there was nowhere to stay. There was no hotel, there was nothing. So they looked at 3 areas. They looked at the Connor settlement, which is of course now Connor Prairie. They looked at this central group of farms, which had become known as the Fall Creek settlement. And they looked at a farm called the Wetzel Farm, which is in present day Waverly. And ultimately they decided in June of 1820, they submitted a report to the General Assembly and said, we have decided on the Fall Creek settlement. That's where our new capital should be. And there were a couple of reasons they chose this location. One was the flat terrain and the fertile soil that had been left over by the glaciers, because of course, then that would be ideal for farming. Another reason was that this was very close to the planned location or planned route for the national road that was eventually going to come through. And they knew that it was going to be important to be near that because it was going to be a major artery for trade and transportation. The other reason they chose this location was because of its being on the White River, which was super navigable and was going to make us a bustling river port community. They were very excited about that. We all know that did not work out. So on January 6th of 1821, the General Assembly approved the surveyor's report and confirmed that this would be the location for a new capital. But before they could pass the bill, they had to choose a name for the new capital city, and nobody could come up with one. Somebody suggested Tecumseh. Somebody else suggested Suwaru, which was a recently discovered island group, which makes no sense. And so they went on back and forth, and nobody could agree. Finally, a man named Jeremiah Sullivan came up with the plan, and he said, look, here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the word Indiana, and we're going to add the Greek word for city, which is polis. So it'll just literally mean Indiana City, Indianapolis. Nobody was quite sure how to pronounce it at the time. But so he presented this idea to the General Assembly. Nobody really liked it, but nobody had any major objections and nobody had any better ideas. So that's how we got the name Indianapolis, very half-heartedly as a sort of last-ditch compromise. So later that year, Alexander Ralston comes to lay out the new city. Ralston had experience laying out the city of Washington, D.C., so there are some similarities in the plans of those cities. So Ralston creates what we now know as the mile square. So this is the plat. It's a 10 by 10 block grid. Up at the top was North Street, and then East, South, and West Streets all surrounding this grid. And of course, it was centered on what we now know as Monument Circle, but which at the time was meant to be, was Governor's Circle. It was meant to be where the governor's mansion was located. They did eventually build a governor's mansion on the circle, but it was completely impractical as a living space. It had no kitchen. It was just very impractical. And the governor's wife at the time said, well, if I hang my laundry out to dry in the backyard, everyone's going to see my underwear because there is no backyard. It's a fishbowl. It's a circle. So no governor ever lived in the governor's mansion on the circle. It was used for events and offices, and then was eventually torn down. And then the circle was a park for a number of years before we got the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in 1902. One note about this plat, a lot of people think we're in the dead exact center geographically of Indiana. That's not exactly true. We're actually shifted about a mile northeast of dead center. And that's primarily because of the location of Pogues Run, which you can see down in the bottom. It would have been more toward the center of the city if we hadn't shifted it, and then it would have been in the way. So Pogues Run has always been considered a nuisance. For years, it was considered a nuisance, I should say, and eventually was sort of diverted into the sewer system. But yeah, so this is the plat as Alexander Ralston envisions it. He thinks that the city will never be any larger than this mile square, because we're in the middle of nowhere, right? It's a swamp, it's a forest. There's nobody here. There's no road to this place. It's the literal wilderness. And he just doesn't foresee it ever becoming a large city. So he says, well, it'll be a beautiful city if it's ever built. But of course it was. And I think it's really important to remember that Indianapolis was a planned community, that it was built from scratch to serve as the state's capital. And it still largely resembles this plat in the mile square area. And so every time I'm right downtown and I'm driving north and I cross over North Street, I think, oh, this was supposed to be the northern border of Indianapolis. And of course, now there's so much more city to go after that. So that always makes me laugh. And the same for East, South, and West Streets. So in 1821, we have the first sale of lots and the first sort of official settlers here. It was a really hard year, 1821. There was a malaria epidemic that killed about 1/8 of the population. And so many other people were sick or taking care of the sick. A lot of the crops did not get tended. So there was a food shortage that first year. But one bright spot in 1821 was Christmas. And this is one of my favorite stories that I discovered during my research, is how Indianapolis celebrated its first Christmas. So it's Christmas Eve, it's late, it's dark, and 4 guys from Kentucky, I should say 4 drunk guys from Kentucky, show up on a boat on the White River. Now, it had to be a very small boat if it came up the White River, but these 4 guys arrive from Kentucky and they need more alcohol, they decide. So they try to break into the store to steal more alcohol because, of course, at this point, the store is closed. Well, they're immediately caught, and now we have a problem. The nearest jail at this time is 60 miles away in Connorsville. It's late, it's dark, it's Christmas, it's the middle of winter. There's no road. Nobody wants to drag these people 60 miles through dense forest at night in the winter to take them to jail. So they come up with a plan. They say, okay, here's what we're going to do. They tell the men, you're going to stay in this abandoned cabin overnight, and then we're going to take you to jail tomorrow. And then they sort of forgot to guard the cabin. So they let the 4 men escape. The 4 men probably thought that they were very clever. But in fact, the intention was that they would escape because then nobody had to drag them off to Connorsville, and they never got to show their faces in Indianapolis again. So it solved the problem. So that's how we celebrated our first Christmas. In 1822, we start to get our first churches, our first newspapers. We get mail service in 1822. And also in 1822, we have the Great Squirrel Invasion. And I have talked about this. I may have talked about this last time I presented to you, because it's one of the stories that I used in my previous book, Secret Indianapolis, because it's just bizarre. But in 1822, we have the Great Squirrel Invasion because that year, the trees, for whatever reason, did not produce enough nuts to feed the squirrels. So in the fall of 1822, everyone in Indianapolis is getting ready to harvest their crops. And all of a sudden, there is an invasion of squirrels. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of squirrels for days. It's like a plague of locusts, except it's squirrels. And people are spending all day out in their fields shooting squirrels and not making a dent even in their numbers. And then they would come home at night. They would spend all night making new bullets, and then they would go back out in the fields the next day and shoot more squirrels. And it sounds very funny now. At the time, it was kind of a disaster because this was their food for the winter that the squirrels were eating. By and large, well, some families did lose their entire crops. Most people managed to save most of their crop. Unfortunately, the squirrels were so hungry and skinny that they were no good for food, really. But I guess probably everyone that winter in Indianapolis had a squirrel skin hat or something like that. But that was the big event of 1822, was the Great Squirrel Invasion. The big event of 1823 was our very first theatrical performance, or professional theatrical performance, I should say. We had our first touring group, Mr. and Mrs. Smith Lately of New York. They performed a couple of plays together, but the big thing was that Mrs. Smith was going to sing the Star-Spangled Banner while dancing a hornpipe, blindfolded amongst eggs. That was their big thing, and she was going to do it without breaking any of the eggs. By all accounts, this was a terrible show, but it was our first entry into the professional theater world, so that was very exciting. If you're familiar with Calvin Fletcher, he was an attorney here in Indianapolis in the early years, and he wrote diaries, which remain very important in terms of our understanding of what happened in those early years. And his quote about this was, "I apologize to myself for going." So on a less humorous note, in 1824, the big event of 1824 is the Fall Creek Massacre. And when I use the word massacre, a lot of people think what I'm talking about is Native Americans killing white settlers. In fact, this was the opposite. There was a group of Native Americans who had spent the winter in the area hunting and trapping. They had a large supply of furs that they were going to sell at the end of the winter. So in the spring, a group of white men entered into their camp and killed everyone, men, women, children, in absolutely brutal ways, and then stole all of their furs and everything else of value. It caused a lot of fear in the community that there would be retaliation. And so essentially, they so they did arrest these men. 4 of them were eventually sentenced to death, and ultimately 3 were executed. 1 was spared because he was younger and had gone with his father and all that sort of thing. So 3 men were executed for this crime. It was the first instance in the United States of a white person being executed for the murder of a Native American. Unfortunately, it didn't set much of a precedent, but it was an important moment in our history, and important to remember. So we're going to skip ahead now to 1831. And this is the year that the steamboat Robert Hanna arrives on the White River. It was named for its owner, Robert Hanna, who had a contract to build part of the National Road. And he was hoping that he could use this steamboat to transport materials and supplies up the White River. And so it arrived on April 11th, 1831, and everyone went crazy because finally this proved that the White River could be navigable and our future as a bustling river port was finally secure. There were ceremonial cannon fire, there was a huge dinner, people made declarations. It was the most exciting thing that had ever happened in Indianapolis ever, and it opened up a whole new bright future for us. Everyone was thrilled. So it arrived on April 11th. On April 12th, the owner offered brief pleasure rides along the river to anyone who was interested. Toward the end of the day, there was a small accident. The boat ran into some overhanging trees and sustained some minor damage. On April 13th, the next day, the boat ran aground on a sandbar. It stayed there for 6 weeks. And when it finally got loose, it left and never returned. So that was the end of our dream of being a bustling river port here in Indianapolis. And one historian actually said something like, nothing but omnipotence could do anything with so sorry a case as the White River. So that's okay though, because 3 years later in 1834, the National Road finally arrives. And you can see it here. It's the red line on the map, which is of course now Washington Street or US 40. So finally, we had some connection with the outside world. Unfortunately, the road was often in absolutely terrible shape. There were very few funds to maintain it. People sometimes had to tie themselves to their wagons in order to avoid falling off when their wagons went into the ruts. It was awful, but at least it was something. It was better than nothing. And that gave us a little taste of having a connection to the outside world. And we decided then that we wanted more. In 1836, the Indiana General Assembly passes what's called the Internal Improvements Act. For context, a couple of years prior to this, the Erie Canal had been built and had been hugely profitable. And every state in the Union wanted their equivalent of the Erie Canal. So this Internal Improvements Act authorized the General Assembly to borrow $10 million to fund a variety of projects around the state. And this included railroads and canals and roads. And you can see all of those laid out there on the map. Indianapolis, of course, was going to have the Central Canal, which was meant to be part of a connection between the Wabash and the Ohio rivers. One historian called this plan, quote, conceived in madness and nourished by delusion, unquote, because the state had borrowed $10 million, but it had made no plans for paying the interest, let alone the principal, on these loans. Because the theory was we would build all this stuff, and then so many tolls would come in, they would cover the entire interest, the entire loan, and maybe also fund the entire state government. That was the plan. All these tolls from all these various modes of transportation. But because it's the General Assembly, instead of doing each project one at a time in a logical fashion, the only way they could get this bill passed was to give every part of the state a piece of the pie. Everybody wanted their own chunk of a project in their area. And so we decided we're going to build everything on this map all at once. So we start competing with ourselves for labor, for materials, and unfortunately, at the same time, there's the Panic of 1837. So in December of 1838, some of these projects have been started in various chunks. Indianapolis has its Central Canal, but it doesn't connect to anything because those other sections haven't been built yet. But in December of 1838, the state owes $200,000 in interest on these loans. To our standards, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but keep in mind that the state's entire annual income for that year, its entire budget, was $45,000. And they owed $200,000 in interest alone. So Indiana essentially went bankrupt over this whole Internal Improvements Act scheme. Most of these projects were never realized because construction on them just stopped when the money ran out. But that's how Indianapolis ended up with its Central Canal that went nowhere. So we're kind of depressed now, right? Our dreams of having river transport are over. We have a national road, but it's terrible. Our canal leads to nowhere. So we're feeling very isolated. But finally, in 1847, the railroad arrives. And the railroad changes everything and changes it very quickly. You can see this map is from 1853, so only 6 years later. This is all the railroad connections in Indiana, and of course, all of them are centered on Indianapolis. Within a matter of months, farmers were realizing twice the profit for their surplus crops. We had a new wave of settlers. Prices on goods at local stores went down because it was much easier to get them into the area. It just changed everything. And finally, Indianapolis became a boom town. And you can see how quickly things start to happen after 1847. The next year, we get Central State Hospital. 2 years later, we get the Slippery Noodle, which is our oldest bar and restaurant in the state, and of course, which you should still go to, still exists. In 1853, we got the Union Depot, which is the precursor to Union Station. And then over the next couple of years, we get a police department, Butler University, the first major theater, the first professional fire department, Christ Church Cathedral, Crown Hill Cemetery. By 1870, we have our first suburb, which is Irvington. 2 years later, Woodruff Place also was established. In 1872 and 1876, we get LS Ayres and Eli Lilly, which of course have been, LS Ayres is gone now, but both of those companies were hugely important to the economic life of the city for, decades after, and still Eli Lilly, obviously. And so you can see that after the railroad arrives in 1847, things really start to happen very quickly, and Indianapolis starts to shape itself into the city as we know it today. The Civil War was an important part of this. We had a number of military encampments in the area. We became a hub for transport of goods related to the war. So that really pushed that growth forward. A couple of fun notes about this, about the things listed here. The police department that was established in 1854 is not the police department that we have today. It only lasted for about a year and a half. And this is because the police department decided that they were going to enforce a local prohibition law. They decided to enforce it at a German beer garden on the east side. A riot ensued, and several civilians were injured. And so public sentiment about the police department was very negative, and the police department had to be disbanded. They created a new one shortly thereafter. But this one that was established in 1854 is not the one we have today. Another fun story is about the fire department, established in 1859. This was the first professional fire department because prior to this, we had volunteer fire companies. And this was the kind of thing, there were dozens of these volunteer fire companies. Every man was involved in one because it was sort of a mark of community engagement. And these volunteer fire departments were known for being a little bit rowdy. They were known for using their engines to spray water through the windows of brothels just for fun. And one year, an insurance company decided that they would give a prize for the volunteer fire company that got first water on the most fires. First water being, their first at the scene. When they issued this prize announcement, suddenly a number of vacant buildings just went up in flames, and weirdly the volunteer fire companies just happened to be right there at the time. So that didn't go well. One volunteer fire company also burned down its own firehouse because it didn't like it and it wanted to get a new one. So these volunteer fire companies were a mess. And so that's why finally the city decided, okay, actually we need to make this a professional situation because this cannot continue. So you can see this is Indianapolis in 1871. So 50 years after our founding. And you can see already we have moved beyond that mile square that Alexander Ralston planned in 1821, and really starting to take shape as the city as we know it today. So in conclusion, one of the things I love about sort of this first 50 years of Indianapolis is how hard we worked just to have transport connections with the rest of the country. And how funny that is in the context that we eventually became what's known as the crossroads of America, and sort of the center of transportation and trade. It didn't used to be like that. And we've grown a lot since those early years in the middle of the wilderness in 1821. And obviously still have, growing to do in the future. So yeah, so that wraps up the presentation. As I said, it's based on my book, Indianapolis: An Illustrated Timeline, which is available in all the usual bookstore type places. Yeah, we do have some time for questions if you have any questions you want to ask. I don't know how you're usually doing Q&A in the context of the Zoom situation, but if you have any questions, let me know.
Yeah, feel free to drop questions in the chat or simply unmute yourself and ask Ashley. Thank you so much for all of this history. And realize, especially with the transportation, all of the starts and stops and how it all wound up coming together. So, yeah.
Ashley.
Type up. Yeah.
Ashley, when Indianapolis's boundaries were originally set, what was just beyond those boundaries? Was it Indian territory or just wilderness?
It was wilderness. It was forest, because so those boundaries were established in 1821, which was the year that the Native Americans had to vacate the state, according to the Treaty of St. Mary's. Not everyone left. There were still a sizable Native American population in the area, but in terms of control of that territory, it had passed over to U.S. control. But yeah, beyond that mile square was just miles and miles and miles of endless forest. So question, what happened that Wabash River could no longer handle the movement of goods? I don't know, because that's not in Indianapolis. I can tell you that the White River never really handled goods, but that's about all I can tell you about that.
Quick question, great presentation. But you mentioned what is the year that the Indians had to vacate Indiana? And then, but my main question is talk about the auto industry. I heard that at one point we had more car companies than Detroit, but yes. I don't know if that's true, or just about the history of the auto industry, the Speedway and all of that.
Right, yeah, so 1821 was the year they had to vacate, to answer your first question. So yeah, we did at one time have a huge automotive industry here in terms of, we actually did have more dealers or more manufacturers than Detroit. Indianapolis always specialized in a more sort of low volume, upscale sort of car, as opposed to the Detroit assembly line type of thing. And ultimately that was our downfall as an automotive center, because during the Great Depression, those car companies that were charging high prices all went out of business. So that was unfortunate. What I did find very interesting in my research was that in the 1890s, Indianapolis had a huge bicycle industry. We had bicycle manufacturers, bicycle dealers, and I didn't realize how much that bicycle industry translated in the next couple of decades into the automotive industry, that we were building the technical skills and expertise that would easily translate. And a lot of the people who were involved in the early bicycle industry became the leaders of our automotive industry. Arthur Newby, who was one of the founders of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, previously had a bicycle track type of speedway that he ran for a couple of years. Carl Fisher, who was another of the founders of the Speedway, initially had a bicycle repair shop and bicycle dealership before he had an automotive dealership. So that was really interesting to me, because I'd never really heard much about the bicycle industry, but in fact, it became hugely important as it translated to the automotive industry. So there's a question in the chat. Our club began in 1916. Can you talk a little about what was happening downtown at that time? By 1916, downtown looked pretty much, especially in the Mile Square, looked pretty much like how it looks today in terms of the buildings and things like that. One thing that was different, of course, on the Circle near the Columbia Club where you usually meet, was at that time, instead of what is currently the quadrant where the Emmis building is, we had English's Hotel and an opera house. And it was a beautiful building with, turrets and spires and all sorts of beautiful stuff that took up the entire quarter of the Circle. And the building of the opera house connected to it was what finally made theater going in Indianapolis sort of socially acceptable, because prior to this, it had been considered a little bit scandalous. But if the Englishes, who were some of the most prominent citizens of Indianapolis, could have a theater, then it must be okay. So that was one of the things that was going on the Circle in 1916. Question, I was under the impression that there was a lot of anti-Native American sentiment in early America. Is that true? If so, was there more resentment after the capital was named Indianapolis? I can't speak to the whole country. Of course, there was a lot of anti-Native sentiment as a whole and a lot of violence. But one thing that's unique about Indianapolis is that we never had any of that violence. There was no, other than the massacre I mentioned where the white people killed the Native Americans, we never had the reverse. We never had any violence of Native Americans killing white settlers here in Indianapolis. George Pogue, as I mentioned, the McCormicks and the Pogues being the first settlers, about a year after the Pogues arrived, George Pogue had some horses stolen. And the speculation was that they had been stolen by some local Native Americans. So he went off into the forest in search of his horses and never returned. We don't know what happened to George Pogue. There is speculation that he was killed by those Native Americans who had stolen his horses. That may or may not be the case. We don't know. If that is the case, it is the only instance that we know of where a white settler in Indianapolis was killed by a Native American. So I think it's important to remember that Indianapolis was sort of unusually peaceful as compared to what we typically think of in that period of settlement. So I think we have a couple more comments. Let me pull those up. Roger says, for anyone interested, there are some wonderful exhibits regarding the Native Americans in Indiana at Prophetstown State Park near Lafayette. That is absolutely true. Prophetstown being named for Tecumseh's brother, who was known as the Prophet. And yeah, I think that's it for the questions, unless anybody has anything else. No? Okay. Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Shit.
I'm sorry, I cannot come to the phone right now. Please leave a message and I will return your call as soon as I can. Thank you very much.
I apologize for the noise. I have my computer that is right next to my phone line. Ashley, this was fascinating. I thoroughly enjoyed hearing everything. And I remember when you were here the last time. And so I'm so happy that you were able to come back and speak to us. We hope to see you again, as a matter of fact. I'm excited about hearing about your book, and I plan to look for it on Amazon. Thanks for letting us know about that. A donation will be made in your name to Freewheelin' Community Bikes. This is an organization that connects a youth with biking skills as well as a shared passion for the bicycle. One bike, one youth, one relationship at a time is their motto.
That's awesome. Thank you.
They are transforming Indianapolis into a bike riding city. As a matter of fact, I'm passionate about biking, and am enjoying the bike routes around the city. Did that did that happen? Did we have bike routes during the time that the bicycle was so prevalent?
No, primarily at that time it was just cycling on the streets until Arthur Newby built his sort of racetrack, which was more designed for racing than for bike racing than it was for just casual riding. But Indianapolis at that time didn't really have much of a park system as we understand it today. So it was primarily just cycling on the roads.
Well, I'm certainly enjoying what we have preserved of the bike culture currently. We will look forward to reading your book. I'm sure that many of us will try to find that book on Amazon, and we will be sending you a certificate of appreciation for your coming to speak to us today. We wish you the best, and we look forward to reading your book. Anything else from the members? What is our program for next week, Kelly?
We have Rick Fusen, who is with Pacer Sports and Entertainment. He's going to be talking about the future of the field house, all of the renovations they've been making, and all the excitement now that there's a naming partner, Gamebridge, associated with the facility. We're also hoping to plug our Hoosiers program at that event, and even talk up our basketball program that the committee's just starting to work on. They'll be hoping to do that in March as a live event.
Anything else from our audience and membership, or anyone else who is online with us today, until we say goodbye and have a wonderful end of the week and weekend.
And just to confirm, next week is Zoom as well?
Correct.
Okay.
Is next week Zoom, or are we?
Yeah, it is a Zoom meeting due to Rick's schedule. One quick thing, Carol, we missed Laura and her guest at the beginning of the call. Laura, do you want to introduce her and see if she wants to talk a little bit?
Yes, thank you. So I just wanted to welcome Aaliyah Rashid to our meeting here today. She's new to Indianapolis, so I think this was quite an introduction for her. Aaliyah, do you want to say hello?
Yes, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Aaliyah Rashid. I just graduated from Butler University, and I'm in the Orr Fellowship. I saw a Butler sign behind there. Yeah, so I'm working at Kiwanis International for 2 years in the Children's Fund. And yeah, I wanted to join the one downtown Indy meeting at least. I just moved to Fountain Square. So thank you all for having me. It was a wonderful presentation.
Well, we hope to have you back here, either on Zoom or in person soon.
When is our next in-person meeting? Does Kelly, can you?
Yeah, so that will be our November 4th, 35th anniversary of Hoosiers. So we really want to come back big and come back strong. So tuck that up amongst your friends, colleagues. I know that Graham would be really excited to have you there.
We'll be there.
And Aaliyah, he works at Butler, so I'm sure that he would be able to tell you lots of stories of Butler that you probably are not aware of.
Yeah, I'm familiar. I've heard the name quite often, I have to be honest. So I hope to see you all in person. Yeah, at the next couple weeks from now.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Leah. Thanks. Anybody else? Okay, everybody, have a wonderful end of the week and great weekend. Hopefully we'll have as beautiful weather as we had today.
Yes.
Great meeting. Bye-bye.